Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, with America pretty equally divided between red and blue, any little electoral advantage goes a long way, which helps explain why there are so many hot-button citizen initiatives on the ballot, says Kristina Wilfore of the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center. Populist and humorist Jim Hightower is still smarting from the 2004 elections and John Kerry's bloodless debate style. Hurricane season is fast approaching. Is the Chesapeake watershed a candidate for a Katrina-style storm? We ask University of Maryland marsh ecologist Court Stevenson. DC's Esther Iverem is out with a new book of compelling poems, and poet Melanie Rivera is thinking about migration. Immigration is on the mind of Gustavo Torres of Casa of Maryland. He'll talk about the explosion of activism in America's substantial immigrant community. And we've got Curtis Blues, the one-man blues band.
Say when the blues come out of Texas, mama, you know they were loping just like a mule.
Welcome to the Forum at the Coffee House. Here in the Mid-Atlantic region, state laws are made by state legislatures, period. But elsewhere around the country, especially west of the Mississippi, citizens who are frustrated with the priorities of their legislators can take lawmaking into their own hands. It's called the ballot initiative process. Want to deny illegal immigrants services or hike the minimum wage? Reactionary causes, progressive causes, no matter. It's all fair game for direct democracy. But ballot initiatives are no longer merely the province of citizen activists. Political parties take a keen interest in the initiative process too. Why? Because in a closely contested race for office, a hot-button initiative on the ballot can stoke voter turnout and decide an election. So what are these hot-button issues in 2006, and how might ballot initiatives affect grassroots lawmaking and the outcome of partisan races? With us is Kristina Wilfore, the Executive Director of the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center. Welcome, Kristina, to the Coffee House.
Thank you.
So do these initiatives really turn elections?
Well, they certainly are an added component to, as you said, influence voter turnout, help candidates set an agenda. That means you're talking about certain issues but not others. I mean, the best example of that out of 2004 would have been the emphasis on, the measures to ban same-sex marriage, with 11 being on the ballot. It certainly meant that that Democrats, progressives, candidates in general weren't talking on their agenda, but having to sort of either avoid this issue or figure out how to respond to it.
So do these issues percolate up from the base, or are they an artifice of the political parties attempting to goose their voter turnout?
Really both, but more the latter. There is a national coordinated strategy, especially in how conservatives and those more on the right have used initiatives as a tool to do a variety of things. Again, turn out conservative voters, wedge progressive voters on a range of social and cultural issues that are very
wedge
touchy.
Progressive voters, you mean split them?
Split them, exactly. When you have, union blue-collar workers who are with progressives on a wide variety of economic issues, when you add in immigration and you add in gay rights issues, they can go a different way. And that's why, initiatives are used very strategically by the other side to do exactly that.
So optimally what you'd want to do if you're running a campaign is both find an issue to put on the ballot that will bring out your voters and find an issue to put on the ballot that will divide the other side's voters.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. And how come the Republicans are more successful at doing this than the Democrats?
Well, partly because the Republicans have done something that our side hasn't, and that's invest in a real state strategy. Over the last 20 years, they have moved state-level think tanks. They've developed farm teams of candidates from city council to state legislatures up to Congress. They've invested comprehensively in looking at initiatives as a tool rather than just a policy mechanism. The folks on our side are very policy-oriented, much probably to our detriment, and so have thought of initiatives in that context rather than a larger electoral tool. which is why we have the situation that we do now.
But you get that still, the citizen initiative in its purest form still emerges in some places, right?
Oh, absolutely. We talk with and hear from many of those activists across the country. The difficult thing with ballot measures, though, especially if you're looking at statewide initiatives, is it's not just about having a popular issue. It's about having the resources to talk to voters, to do polling. Initiatives are, very much a science. And so, therefore, it's not just knowing that people support health care. That's not good enough in passing, a fair health care, fair pay as an initiative. So it's much more complicated. So the grassroots piece of it, especially because of the amount of money and time to actually qualify an initiative, is extremely expensive and onerous. And actually that comes more from state legislators who have made the process more difficult and out of the reach for grassroots folks because they find these initiatives to be problematic and undermining of their role as a state legislator.
And in fact, in some places like Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, you can't even do these things at the state level, right?
Right. The process was formed really in the early 1900s and mostly in the West as a way to wrest control away from railroad interests who had a lot of say in state government. So it was really a sort of power to the people. Unfortunately, though, you have a variety of special interests now, and mostly at the national level, who are using it to import their agenda into particular states. So we've lost, to a large degree, a lot of that grassroots activism that this process was really made for.
And it's become more and more professionalized, and I gather that you see your role as attempting to learn all the techniques that have been perfected on the right and see if they can't be applied for progressive side.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the biggest problem that we lack on our side is really political will. It's not necessarily not having good ideas or not having some of the resources. It's choosing to participate in developing a real strategy around initiatives that is missing, but really happening in pockets of the country much more aggressively than it ever has.
And on what issues are progressives making headway?
Well, minimum wage is a great example for some of the things that we brought up. It may be on the on the ballot in as many as 6 to 7 states this cycle, which would be one of the first sort of multi-state issues that is progressive and that drives progressive turnout and that is on our agenda. And we've seen in the past, it's passed in several states in 2004, both in Florida and Nevada, that it was very helpful for creating a very economic populist agenda that candidates could utilize and speak on. And it was very motivating to young voters and new registered voters and other voters who were hard.
Can you quantify the impact that it had on the election races?
Well, in Nevada, you can look at the state assembly races. The progressive community working at a variety of levels in that state, really believed that they won 16 to 18 of their targeted state assembly races because of the presence of the ballot measure on minimum wage and how candidates utilized it and talked about it and how they ran field programs that were coordinated in order to get the kind of turnout that they got.
And was there a countervailing initiative from the Republicans or the conservatives on the ballot?
Not that had as much of a pickup to Republican candidates. In fact, you saw a quote after the election by the anti-tax, activist, Axe the Tax guy in Nevada who said, they should erect a statute to Danny Thompson, who's the president of the AFL in Nevada, because this was a smart tool that they used and we should have gone forward with our measure. And we didn't really have anything to counterweight, what our side did in that state.
It strikes me that the reason that the right has been very successful with this is because oftentimes they're appealing much more to the emotions than to the economic or the intellect. Right. Can progressives really compete on that terrain?
I think so, and I think we have some issues this year that are an example of that. I will say, though, that it's the social issues that are the toughest. I mean, in general in our country, when you're talking about race or gay rights, you need a lot of time to have a conversation with people, and you need a movement. And initiatives are anything but allowance of time. They're short on time for when you actually get something on the ballot and the resources you need to communicate. But when you take issues like the right to research on stem cells, for example, California in 2004 passed a measure that allowed bonding to support stem cell research. What we've seen since in very conservative areas that they're passing legislatively bans on the right to research even. So it's not even about the funding or a tax component. They want to outlaw just even the right to research in that state. And that's going to be on the ballot in Missouri that would overturn that right to research. And it's a big problem for you have sort of the wingnut right-wingers with the biotech conservatives, and that's a real problem in their own community.
Minimum wage, stem cells. What else does the progressive community have to offer on the initiative front?
Renewable energy, which is really interesting in that you can talk about it and take it out of the framework that has just been about pro-environment and really have a conversation about our dependency on foreign oil. And, Bush is certainly saying a lot at the federal level about his ideas around renewable energy. None of that is happening or in motion. Whereas states, in Colorado did this in 2004, Washington and California are going to go to a vote with it this year, are really putting a real formula together and going to put this to the voters and will probably be very helpful to some competitive races.
When you say a real formula, what do you mean?
Well, it requires a state, it mandates that the state transfer to a certain amount of renewable resources.
A renewable portfolio standard.
Exactly.
Okay. And what about the right? What are they doing?
Well, they're never lacking in energy. One of the biggest multi-state sort of efforts going on right now is called TABOR, what's called the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. Colorado had this in law for about 9 years, and they just voted last November to temporarily repeal it. It sets a very complicated formula, a spending cap of sorts for a state. The problem is it's a very simplified, let's shrink government, but at the same time it has really bad effects on universities and healthcare systems, squeezing everything that the state wants to do, even in economic development. You had the Chamber of Commerce even in Colorado at the end opposed to this. But it doesn't matter, so you have Washington insiders, Grover Norquist, Americans for Tax Reform, Dick Armey through Freedom Works, and a variety of other players who are using this and pushing this out into the states and really tying it in with Republican candidates that they're supporting, like Bob Beers in Nevada, who's the sponsor of the measure there, and Kim Blackwell in Ohio.
Okay, so anti-tax, anti-immigration, anti-gay. Mm-hmm. Is that the conservative agenda on?
That would be a big part of it, yes.
And so how do you respond to the anti-immigration? There's obviously now a counter movement that's grown and shown itself to be powerful. Will that scare off the anti-immigration initiatives, or will that simply balloon them?
Well, I think we'll have to see. It will most likely be on the ballot in Colorado. And I think the challenge is that in certain states, people do want a solution around immigration and see it as a problem. Unfortunately, the kind of proposal that they're pushing as an initiative is very simplistic and won't really get at that solution. At the same time, probably jeopardizes the delivery of emergency services and fire services because of, making firefighters have to be immigration officers, and an ambulance, have to check the status of, whether you're an immigrant or not. And I don't think any community really wants that.
All right, let's say you're a Democratic candidate in a state, very close race, and on the ballot is an initiative to ban gay marriage. What do you do?
Mm-hmm. Well, you could take Colorado, for example, where they have a tight gubernatorial, likely to be election there. They've expanded their majorities in the state house and want to expand them even more. They've got some important races. And you have the attempt to ban same-sex marriage on the ballot. Now, what is also likely on the ballot at the same time is a proposal to allow domestic partner benefits. I think for Democratic candidates and others who aren't necessarily pro-gay, or as the other side would sort of characterize them, what they can do is talk about the real implications of these laws that go beyond gay marriage. They go into senior citizens and other heterosexual couples who benefit by existing domestic partner laws. And so it really shows the extreme nature of some of these proposals when they, try to push something that is really meant to be a political ploy, but has serious consequences in terms of public policy.
Well, thank you very much, Kristina Wilfore of the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, for keying us into what's coming before the voters in 2006 and how ballot initiatives change the way we make laws and choose our political leaders. I'm Mark Cohen, and this has been Coffee House Forum.
Let me read you something. This is from Sam Houston when he was running for president of the Republic of Texas in 1842 against a man named David Burnett, and they were in a debate. And Burnett had been scalding Houston with all sorts of diatribes, and Houston in this debate turned to Burnett, and he said to him, "You prate about the faults of other men, while the blot of foul, unmitigated treason rests upon you, you political wrangler and canting hypocrite, whom the waters of Jordan could never cleanse from your political and moral leprosy." Don't you wish John Kerry had turned to Bush in that debate and said something like that? That's it. That's the spirit that we...
Esther Iverem is a Washington, D.C. based journalist. She's also one of the most original poetic voices to come down the proverbial pike in quite some time. Her new book, entitled Living in Babylon, Poems and Performances, is a dizzying yet measured stew of meditations in which the reader encounters fellow poets like Pablo Neruda, the abolitionist Harriet Tubman, and, most importantly, Iverem's always firm but lyrical takes on everything from the madness of war to the strength and challenges of motherhood. But Iverem doesn't let the aforementioned themes drown her voice in mawkish cliches or shallow hyperbole. Her language is a living example of Amiri Baraka's definition of poetry, speech musicked. Babylon's strongest poem, entitled What Do You Believe In?, is rife with language which dances with and off the tongue. It is angry, impassive, lyrical. It makes us return to its details, and it makes us think. Esther Iverem's Living in Babylon is a strong, uplifting reminder that poetry can indeed be, as Ezra Pound once noted, news that stays news. These poems swing like the Count Basie Orchestra in its prime and deftly document life's changing same. I'm Reuben Jackson, and this has been Writer's Block.
Welcome to 21st Century Live here at the Coffee House. It's often hard to think of global warming as a local problem. Melting ice caps and drowning polar bears seem so far away as to be abstractions. But events in recent months suggest the danger is getting much closer to home. The record hurricane season of 2005 had the fingerprints of global warming all over it, scientists say. And the next hurricane season, beginning June 1st, just a few weeks away, could be even worse thanks to increasingly warm ocean waters bred by a changing climate. Add to this warming sea levels worldwide that are rising thanks in part to the rapid melting of the Greenland ice cap, and you've got a 1-2 punch that worries ecologists and preparedness officials throughout our watery Chesapeake region. What, if anything, can be done to slow down the warming? And given that meaningful additional warming is already guaranteed, what can we do in this region to prepare for and adapt to rising seas and more ferocious hurricanes? Here to discuss these issues is Dr. Court Stevenson, a marsh ecologist at the University of Maryland and an expert on local impacts of climate-induced sea level rise. Court, welcome to the Coffee House.
Thanks, Mike.
Let me begin by asking you, are we already seeing sea level rise in the Chesapeake Bay related to global warming?
Yes, sea level in the Chesapeake Bay is a little bit more prolific than the rest of the planet. Actually, we're about 50% higher than the mean around the globe. And that means at Baltimore, for example, we've had about a foot, maybe 13 inches over the last century.
And as we're seeing the sea level rise in the Chesapeake Bay as part of a worldwide trend, what are some of the impacts that we're seeing right now from this global warming-induced sea level rise?
Well, I'm a marsh ecologist, so I started noticing marsh declines south of the laboratory where I work at Cambridge, Maryland. And that's one of the big things that we've seen is that we've had about 5,000 or 6,000 acres now lost in the middle of the refuge. And we think that's primarily due to sea level. But there are other things too that are telltale signs. One of the problems is shore erosion. Shore erosion has definitely picked up over the last century as we see that sea level expand quite a bit.
I know even Smith Island, the last inhabited island in Maryland's portion of the Chesapeake Bay, is eroding so quickly, 30 feet a year along some shorelines on Smith Island because of the sea level rise.
Yeah, Smith, Tangier, and then we've had islands that have totally disappeared, like Sharps Island, where we used to have a hotel and numerous kind of hunting activities. It's just totally in the bay.
So we got about a foot of relative sea level rise or more in the last 100 years in the Chesapeake Bay. Looking forward, how much more sea level rise can we expect, according to scientists?
Yeah, that's the $1,000 question. One of the problems that we had was when we first started looking at this, worldwide scientists were estimating between 1 and 3 feet by 2100 as far as an increase. However, recently, as you pointed out, Greenland looks like it's melting faster. And then we have on top of that, Antarctic melting seems to be much faster than we thought. So one of the things is probably a little over 20 feet of ice in both of those locations. And that could really disappear within a couple centuries.
I know Jim Hansen at NASA says that we could see 20 feet of sea level rise, maybe not by the end of the 21st century, but even if we were to get as high as 10 feet of sea level rise in this century, that would obviously be a lot. Now you say you've seen marshes disappearing. They literally drown as the sea level rises. And we also know that hurricanes are becoming more intense. Tell us for a moment, what role do marshes play in that surge tide that hurricanes push toward land?
I think the classic example is New Orleans, where there used to be a huge acreage of marsh to the south, but subsequently we've really had a lot of inundation of the marshes, and we've had open bays, and the hurricanes just come right in and they overtop the water, and just the surge just hits the city much faster. Now, if you have intact marsh grass and even maybe some shrubs in that marsh, you really slow down that water, and it really does work in your favor if you're trying to really protect a city or any kind of population.
Now, I know the National Academy of Sciences, right in downtown Washington, D.C., has a museum where you can push a button that shows what would happen to the Chesapeake Bay with 3 feet of sea level rise, and you see the marshes completely disappearing. Blackwater Wildlife Refuge completely disappears. If that happens, are we looking at much more damage from hurricanes in this region?
Oh, certainly. I think that the city of Cambridge, which is just north of Blackwater, would definitely be affected, or more affected, if we get that next hurricane. And we haven't had a hurricane that's been really sizable for over 45, 50 years in Chesapeake Bay.
Now, we know that it's the use of fossil fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas that's driving global warming, and we know if we want to slow the warming down and slow down the sea level rise, we've got to make a quick switch to clean renewable energy. But some meaningful warming is already in the bank because this carbon dioxide stays up there for quite a while. If you're already seeing some sea level rise in the Chesapeake Bay, as you mentioned, are you already seeing some human adaptation to that rise?
Oh, clearly. Humans adapt very fast to a lot of environmental situations, and one of the things that happens pretty quickly is that they try to protect their shorelines. If you've got expensive real estate, you want to make sure that it doesn't erode very quickly. So one of the things is people have tried to do seawalls, and where we are, seawalls went up about 100 years ago. So I think that's one of the things that.
Now, by seawall, you mean what exactly?
Just a revetment, usually stone, sometimes concrete.
Just build a wall right where it used to be marshes or beach.
Correct. Yes, but we don't like that ecologically because it doesn't provide a lot of habitat for a lot of the biota that normally are associated with Chesapeake Bay, especially the terrapins. It's hard for a terrapin to come up and really lay eggs on a seawall.
Well, I know that when marshes are confronted with sea level rise, their natural tendency is to migrate inland. And this bulkheading or these seawalls that people with property they want to protect put up can cause problems.
Yeah, definitely. A marsh against a seawall just doesn't work. It eventually erodes out pretty quickly.
So how much of the bay shoreline has already been armored, as they say? Has it been turned into bulkheading?
I've seen various estimates, but probably 20% is a high number.
So we're talking hundreds of miles
of
the bay have already been armored.
Oh, yes, definitely. And there's probably about 6,000 miles total bay.
Now, is this the solution? I mean, we're going to turn every shoreline into an armored wall, or what if we were to just do the Holland thing? What if we just built a giant seawall, literally a giant wall at the mouth of the bay? Couldn't we just forget about sea level rise and go about our business?
Well, the organisms in Chesapeake Bay that depend on migrating into fresh water and migrating out, the crabs and fish like rockfish, you just really would cut off a lot of that. And I wouldn't really think that that would be a viable solution.
But even if people were to say, well, I don't really care for the taste of rockfish, I don't even like to go fishing for them, technically or in an engineering sense, is it possible to build a seawall across the mouth of Chesapeake Bay?
Well, I think one of the problems would be that you have to also put a big revetment down the Virginia side of the peninsula, the northern side of the peninsula, excuse me, and that would really probably be a huge expense. Engineering-wise, it probably also doesn't make a lot of sense with naval vessels going in and out. You're probably better off working further up the estuary somewhere.
And okay, so if we know we can get between 1 and 3 feet of sea level rise this century, maybe even more, the water is rising, the marshes are disappearing. That creates a watery flight path for future hurricanes, and also the water is just getting closer to homes. Is this something that eventually could threaten our large cities, Washington, Baltimore, and if so, what can we do?
Yeah, I'm especially worried about Washington and Baltimore. Basically, they're Maryland places on the bay, but Washington really had very low-lying landscape anyway. The mall is pretty low, and if you really want to protect like the National Archives and things like that, you probably need to think about floodgates at some point. Now, the problem with floodgates are that
what is a floodgate, first of
all? Well, floodgates are equivalent to what you put on the Thames when you really had high tides coming off the North Sea up the Thames estuary. Basically, they've been able to install these huge gates that sort of rotate up and down with the tide. And I think they've used these almost 50 times, or just about 50 times.
So it's not a permanent structure. It opens and closes,
right.
And you would close it when you get a big surge.
Exactly, yeah.
So this might be something that could protect Washington from the really big surges of future hurricanes.
Yeah.
Given that sea level rise is bringing the water closer to the city.
I mean, Washington, you might be able to put one up across the Potomac near Mount Vernon at some spot there where you could really control the tidal surge coming up.
I mean, this is just a fantastic concept. I mean, a lot of people think of global warming as this future abstraction and all that, but you're talking about almost inevitably, I assume, that we may need to build some big kind of gate-like structure on the Potomac just to keep the city of Washington from flooding.
Well, it's happened with Venice and London and Rotterdam, and I expect sooner or later that technology is going to be exported here, especially with the sea level rates that we're seeing. And
we're also talking about maybe a similar kind of gate in Baltimore. Where would that go?
Well, that would be a little bit more difficult, and I think maybe a little bit more far-fetched. I think you'd really have to be careful with Baltimore because you've also got toxic materials in the sediments and things like that where you wouldn't want to block it up very long because you might have problems due to just high toxic levels in the water, which you probably wouldn't want.
Well, I mean, just given all this talk of armoring shorelines, building these walls, floodgates, I mean, this sounds like complicated stuff. I mean, as a marsh ecologist, someone who studies how land and water interact, what do you say to people? There are a lot of people out there who say, well, we'll just adapt. We'll just adapt to global warming, let the seas rise, let the hurricanes get more fierce. But, I mean, what would you say to that kind of approach?
Well, I think there's a certain amount of adaptation that you can do. For example, the Venice adaptation to sea level is to put $10 billion worth of tide gates on there. But that'll only hold Venice probably till mid-century at the most. So it's really quite an expensive proposition. And it really does go into the billions pretty quickly. If you were to replace the marshes the way we are now, building marshes on Poplar Island, we have an estimate at present that it's about $500,000 an acre to really replace a marsh with protection and for the future. And you could see if you have 300,000 marshes, 300,000 acres of marshes in Chesapeake Bay, you really get into the billions there if you really want to restore those marshes. So it's always better if you can keep the resource there rather than try to restore it.
And keeping the resource there would mean slowing the actual warming.
Exactly.
And instead of just adapting and slowing the actual warming, of course, would mean stop burning so much oil, coal, and natural gas. I want to thank our guest, Court Stevenson, for joining me to talk about the suddenly rapid approach of global warming into the heart of our lives right here in the watery Chesapeake region. A national program to cut greenhouse gases is needed immediately, of course, but will armored shorelines and a massive floodgate to protect Washington, D.C. soon be part of our world too? Whatever happens, it's clearly time for a new approach to life in the 21st century. I'm Mike Tidwell.
Texas, mama, they were loping just like a mule. Say when the blues come out of Texas, mama, you know they were loping just like a mule. Yeah, but those Texas women, man, you know they're just too hard to fool. Understand. I said I love you, pretty baby. I just hope you understand. That I don't want to marry, babe. I just want to be your man.
Big Joe Williams,
Well,
traveling man.
welcome to the Coffee House, Curtis.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. You know, I realize you're one of the few acts we've had here where we don't need to tell people, now be sure and turn off your cell phones because it'll interfere. It's blasting right over them. It's great. How'd you get into this music?
Well, when I was 14 years old, there was a folk revival, and that was a lot of people who were looking into the roots of rock music. And I heard
Give me a
something.
year. What year are we talking about?
So we're talking about 1969, and And I first heard somebody play a harmonica in this unique way, which was an innovation musically. They took the European harmonica, but they didn't play it like the Europeans. They changed the shape of their mouth to bend a note. So I heard somebody taking a note like this and turn it into this.
Sort of sliding over and bending the reed.
Yeah, and so that flattered the notes, and I'm actually 5 chromatic steps away from my guitar, but I bend it back to the guitar. But it makes it much more like the human voice. And I was so gripped by that sound, you know, I really felt that's the sound of how I feel.
And you were 14 at the time?
Exactly right. And fortunately, at that time, it was more accessible. I think it was really, although now, of course, we've got all these reissues of all my favorite players.
Yeah, and they're cleaned up, and you can hear them.
Yeah,
actually.
exactly
You don't
right.
have to wonder what was going on. High school, did you go through the metal stage? Not metal as in this metal, but
I really was a
high-speed
blues
rock
man.
and roll.
I was a blues man from the get-go, and I played in blues bands as a harmonica player for many years. And it was years later that I just sort of bumped into the concept of a one-man band style. You know, Robert Lighthouse, a local musician, is a big influence on my music, and he introduced me to Dr. Isaiah Ross, who really plays this whole rig together in a really cool way. And otherwise, it can be kind of silly, and it can detract from the music. But the way Dr. Ross played it, it really added to it.
That song that you played was Big Joe Williams?
Yeah, Big Joe Williams.
What are you going to take us out with?
Okay, I'm going to play a song called "Rock Me" by Muddy Waters, who's been covered by a lot of different players. And
Was
I'm going to
this
use
early in his career?
Yes. And although he still plays it.
Take us home.
Thank you very much. I want you to rock me. Baby, rock me all night long. And I said, I want you to rock me. Baby, rock me all night long. I want you to rock me, little girl. Yeah, baby, like my back ain't got no bone. I want you to roll me, baby, just like a wagon wheel. I want you to roll me, baby, just like a wagon wheel. You know when you roll me that way, baby, you don't know how good it makes me feel. Maybe you do, girl. We'll play some harmonica now. Throw your arms around me, babe, just like a circle around the sun. Just throw your arms around me, baby, just like a circle around the sun.
better chain her right by your side. If you want to keep that fine-looking woman, man, I suggest you chain her by your side. You know, 'cause if she flagged this train, man, I'm sure gonna let her ride. I want you to rock me, baby. Baby, rock me all night long. Said I want you to rock me, baby. Baby, rock me all night long. And I want you to rock me, little girl. Baby, like my back ain't got no bone.
The places in you I do not know peck at me like little birds perched inside your big black boots, their noses underneath our bed. Squeaking our mattress in the cold, sound your guilt, reddens our faces. 30 years and still those boots pretend to know no other bed. Then he is born, this wingless sparrow, and silent shivers on our mattress, the high chair borrowed from our basement, for the woman you cheated, her baby bird. Do you know of the address I found for her, the midnight I drove with only my sister, to curse her door, to burn her bed, as every woman said I should? Know that I turned when I imagined, her eyes swollen, sobbing for those black boots, the screaming and sweat of a hospital room that she bore like a bullet, alone.
Welcome to Work Life at the Coffee House. Hundreds of thousands of people in cities across the country have been demonstrating for immigrant rights. We haven't seen such protests since the days of the Civil Rights Movement. Many say we're witnessing the dawning of a new social movement, a movement for immigrant rights. CASA of Maryland has been at the center of this movement in this region and has played a key role in organizing the first mass demonstrations in front of the Capitol on March 7th. Anti-immigrant legislation passed by the House of Representatives is said to have kicked off the demonstrations. But regardless of the outcome of the legislation, have we turned a corner? Is this the beginning of a new era in how we see immigrants in this country? To discuss all of this, I am delighted to have with us today Gustavo Torres, who is the Executive Director of CASA of Maryland and a prominent leader in our Latino community. And I have to say, I have been privileged to do some work with CASA de Maryland. Welcome to the Coffee House, Gustavo.
Thank you, Fred.
So tell us, what's going on out there in the streets? Where are all these people coming from?
Well, Fred, as you mentioned before, what happened is that in December, the House of Representatives passed a very anti-immigrant legislation that touched the life of millions of people, not only the immigrant community, but the people in general. They penalize any people who are undocumented or penalize anybody who provides services to undocumented workers. So people become very upset and become very disappointed. So they started to call our offices and say how we can demonstrate that we are very upset in a pacific way. So we started to think with the workers and with the community that the best approach is to go out at the streets and send a very clear message to the policymaker, telling them that they run a big mistake.
Well, tell me, did you expect to see this kind of response?
No, absolutely no. We didn't actually. Initially, for instance, in March 7, when we started this process, we expect between 10 to 15,000 people. That was huge for us. We call a lot of people, our community, etc. But then when you went to the Capitol Hill and you see more than 50,000 people, and then around the nation you see thousands and thousands of people. In LA, you saw 500,000 people. What we really realized was that the situation is very serious for our community, and the community sent a very clear message to us as leaders, as well as the community in general. We want to stop these anti-immigrant attacks. That is exactly the message they sent to us.
So where is this going? I mean, it's the legislation. It seems to be in response to the legislation, and that could go any which way, and the legislation can come back year after year. But where do you see this going?
Well, what we expect is that it's going to be a movement very similar like the civil rights movement during the 60s. We believe that right now we are marching, that we are protesting against these anti-immigrant legislations, but we are going to vote in November, and we are going to vote in 2008 and so. And we would like to send a very clear message that we not only go to the streets to demonstrate, but also we are going to exercise these tremendous privileges, which is vote in this country.
So this goes beyond the legislation?
Without no question. That is our goal, and we're moving in that direction.
Well, let's think about some of the issues, though, in terms of the reform proposals that are out there. We know that one of the issues is enforcement, and one of the issues is legalization of the 12 million or so who are here undocumented. But then there's also this question of future flow. What happens from here on out in terms of the policy towards immigration? What's your take on that?
Sure. Our approach and the way how we see that this situation could be resolved is that we need to have a comprehensive immigration reform. And let me explain to you and to our friends what exactly means that. We believe that is very important to resolve and to provide opportunities to more than 12 million undocumented workers right over here in this country. But also, every year between 300 to 400,000 people arrive to the United States illegally because the economy requests them. The economy requests the services. Nobody provides that kind of services that undocumented workers provide. We believe that it's very important to regularize that. We believe that the guest workers are very important, but we need to emphasize that need to be linked with workers' rights, because if we only provide a guest workers, what is going to happen is a lot of exploitation, abuses, etc. So we believe that we need to link a guest worker with a very strong component of worker rights.
So that, if you could talk a little bit more, because some people say that if markets are flooded with immigrant workers and there's an increase in the flow of immigrant workers, that's going to cause wages to go down and working conditions to go down. So,
well, absolutely no. I mean, what the legislation that we are proposing, and actually is very similar what the Judiciary Committee in the Senate passed, is pretty much to regularize the people that pass anyway. We are not speaking about to increase more immigrants that come into this country. We are speaking about the regularization of these people who are undocumented. Now, let me tell you, just put one example. Think about 20 years from now. The last legalization was in 1886, 20 years from now. Think about the great contribution that the immigrant community make to this economy. Everybody say that it's a great economy, that everybody benefit from that, etc. Think about the amazing contribution that we did through these 20 years, and see that we are not cause any problems to the economy. By the contrary, we are helping and make a great contribution, and not only the economy, the diverse of this great society in Paris because the immigrant community.
But you did mention worker protections. I mean, explain a little bit more what you mean by the need for worker protections.
Sure. I think that is very important to have the worker have the opportunity to make formal complaints, to ensure that the minimum wage is going to be respected, to ensure that if you have been abused, you have channels to receive any worker who have been abused. Right now, what is happening is with an undocumented worker, he or she is very scared to make a complaint, because in some occasions what happens is that the employer called the INS, the immigration officers, and in some occasions have been deported. So I think that is the reason why we say that it's very important to have the combination of the legal opportunities for the workers to make formal complaints as well as the guest workers.
So tell us about Casa de Maryland. Where did Casa de Maryland come from? What does it do? When did it start? Tell us something about your story.
In 1985, we started in 1995 due to the political and difficult situation and economical situation in Central America. I mention all the time that President Reagan make a great contribution to this diversity that is happening right now in Maryland and in the Washington metro area due to the bad policies in Latin America and in Central America. With these really bad policies, what happens is that many people need to flow to this country because the Reagan administration support the paramilitary groups of the army who kill a lot of people in Central America. So now many people live in this country. They create their roots right over here. Now they have families, and you see the diversity that we have in this Washington region area.
What does Casa do?
Started to provide services to those people who just arrived: immigration services, employment, English classes, computer classes, all the kind of assistance that we provide. During the 90s, when the community started to stabilize much better, so we provide citizenship classes, and we create the first worker center in particular in Montgomery County.
Stop right there. What is a worker center?
A worker center is a place where we regularize the day laborers. What is happening, and probably many people heard about the Herndon situation, as well as in Montgomery County, the day laborers in Baltimore City, workers waiting for jobs at the corners. What we do back to 15 years ago, with the support of the police department, with the support of the civic associations, with the support of the local government, was to create an alternative for hundreds of workers waiting for jobs at the corner. So what we're doing is that we match the right employer with the right worker, as well as we provide English classes. We have a huge waiting list of day laborers and domestic workers who really want to improve the English, who really want to learn more English because they know that it's very important in this society, learning English. And also, a strong component of our worker center is the legal advice and legal protection for the workers. We have in this moment 5 different attorneys who protect the workers when they have been abused by the employer.
So what happens when an employer comes to the center to looking for work?
Well, an employer who come to the center, or even not necessarily they need to come to the center. Normally, a lot of employers call us because we already have the recognition. They call or they visit our facilities. So they say, I need 3 workers. So we have a list of the workers who have professional skills and workers who are laborers. So if you request somebody who is a laborer, we gather the list and we pass to you the labor plus 2 carpenters, for instance.
And do you have minimum standards in terms of pay?
Without no question. The workers themselves, and that is the beauty to have an organized site, because when you have an organized site, the workers themselves, they put the scale of salaries. The minimum wage in our organization, in our worker center, is $10 per hour, and then go up. A professional carpenter is $25 per hour. So it's very important to have a regularized and organized site for benefits of the employers and the workers.
Are there other groups like Casa de Maryland? There's Casa de Maryland unique across the country?
No. In the Washington metro area, we have like 15 different worker centers with different organizations providing worker centers. In the national level, we have 65 different worker centers. And we created a national day labor organizing network that we come together to exchange the best practice, to work together to accomplish different goals. So it's a great opportunity to share our experiences at the national level.
Great. And does it basically serve the Latino community?
Not necessarily. And let me tell you, Fred, something that is happening with Casa of Maryland and the community at large. During the 80s was focused mostly in Central Americans because the majority were Central American. During the 90s, Latinos, including people from South America. Now the new dynamic that we have during the 2000 is people from different countries of Africa. So now in our organization, we need to speak Portuguese, English, and French, because this is the great diversity that we have, not only in Casa, but in general in this great society.
So what do you see? We have about a minute left. Where do you see all of this going? You've got the formation of worker centers across the country. You've got this rising up within within the community that's caused a whole lot of interest. What do you see next?
Well, what I believe is that it's the time for us to speak out, to send a very clear message to the policymakers that they need to watch what they're doing, because today we march, tomorrow we vote.
So you do think that this is going to carry over into electoral politics, into the political
Without
process?
no question, and we're moving in that direction. After we finish all of these activities in terms of demonstrations, etc., our next steps in the next few months is to register thousands and thousands of immigrants to vote in November and in 2008.
Great. Well, thank you, Gustavo Torres of CASA of Maryland. The rights of the huge immigrant population do seem to be moving to center stage in this country. Where it's all going is hard to know, but it feels like a sleeping giant has begun to stir, and things will never be quite the same. I am Fred Feinstein, and this has been Work Life.